Yeah, because I got there from school years ago.
But it's like way out of comfort zone. So then
often associated with a deliberate absence of history, a kind of art science that emerges from this blank slate in the lab. But this is hardly the case for these three. In many ways, their work takes place away from the mainstream institutions of traditional performing arts, either through deliberate rejection or because of the traditional institutions excluding them. But precisely because of this tension between historical and experimental practice, they engage history and traditional arts too, in the case of Mie and Brooke, in very profound and beautiful and sometimes humorous ways. I should also mention that the idea of Japan is a framework for today's gathering, and it initially motivated bringing these three artists together, but their role as key figures in U.S. Artistic geographies of downtown New York and West Coast Bay Area scenes is equally as significant. So for the gathering today, I've asked each of the artists to present things that some of you hopefully had a chance to take a look at beforehand, and I've also asked them to speak a little bit about their work through the idea of history as performance, or history through performance. And their approaches could not be more different, and yet their projects, I think, draw out the contemporary social and political possibilities of performing history as an embodied practice. So we're going to have 3 presentations, and I ask that you hold your questions until the discussion period later on, so that we have a chance to kind of think through the 3 presentations rather than addressing each one individually. Following the presentations, we'll have a movement workshop, a delicious movement workshop led by Eiko Otake, which everyone is encouraged to take part in, and we'll move the chairs again. I'll ask for your help, I think. And following that, we'll have a discussion led by Professor Marilyn Ivy, and we'll talk through everything and anything that we can. So first, and before I move on to the main part of this program, I also want to give a shout out to a few people, Kim Brandt, Catherine Forche, Pam Rodman, Alex Barnett, Laman Go, and a huge thank you to the artists, Brooke, Eiko, and Mia for their patience and working with me to put this program together. So I'm going to keep my introductions of people to a minimum because we have many artists and scholars who you are probably already familiar with. And I will point you to their bios. There's a program that should be circulating if you don't already have one. So please refer to those for their bios. So the first presentation is by Brooke O'Hara. She's an actor and director of the Theater of a Two-Headed Calf. And her work is currently on view at the New Museum. You can see part of it here as part of the exhibition, Trigger, Gender as a Tool and Weapon. So please help me in welcoming Brooke.
I think I might stand. I noticed being back there that it's better if I stand, right? Okay. So many things to think about here. Okay. So today I'm gonna just, first of all, thank you for having me, and I just feel really honored to be here with Mia and Eiko, who are both incredible artists who I admire a great deal. So I'm really grateful that you brought us all here together, Miki. And thank you, Lemon and Kamari, for your help also today and before. So today, this is, am I too loud or too quiet? I'm always so weird. I'm looking at my stage manager, who's not actually here in the official capacity, but it's always good to have someone to rely on. So I'd like to discuss 2 projects with the idea that we can use them as a jumping off point for discussion between the 3 of us. And typically I don't read these things, but I'm just going to read some of this quickly because I want to respect time. So I wrote things so I could respect time. The 2 major projects are the production I created and directed in 2007 with my theater company, the Theater of a Two-Headed Calf, a kabuki play called Drum of the Waves of Horikawa. And it's by Manzaimon Chikamatsu, and it was written in 1707. And then I'll talk just briefly about the other project, which is a live lesbian soap opera, Room for Cream, which I created with the Dyke Division of Two-Headed Calf. And actually all the founders of the Dyke Division were performers in this kabuki project. And the kabuki project, we serialized specifically so that we could kind of recycle some of the actors, and also I was interested in the form of serial, and each sort of scene made sense as an episode, and there were 20-minute episodes. But in New York, we performed the whole 5 episodes in an evening, but elsewhere we performed them in parts, and people had to come back to see it on recurring nights or whatever. Okay, so, I'll begin by talking about the kabuki play. But in order to explain my process and our methods, I have to begin by saying something you probably know, which kabuki, as most people know it, is an extremely codified ancient Japanese performance form in which performers are all male, they train in a family, and they learn their roles through a kind of body-to-body memorization. And so the question is, how did I, as a female American director, negotiate deep histories of that rigid form? And I also want to address the conditions, concerns, and challenges of our kind of contemporary moment, from an awareness that this moment is populated by objects, forms, texts, political ideologies, or sentiments that have aged through a complex and dynamic process entirely relevant to our own understanding of our present day selves. We can get back to that. That's for the scholars to decide. No. Okay, sorry. The art of kabuki is, in fact, been through a process of aging or maybe growth, and of conservation. And I'm going to take a moment to give you a brief history because I think it's important that you understand that kabuki was not always a codified form. I know it was, so I'm going to squeeze like 400 years of history into a few bullet points, if you don't mind. It evolved as a theatrical practice during the Tokugawa regime, which is 1603 to 1868. It was essentially an era of military rule in Japan. And the title kabuki comes from the slang term kabuki mono, which was used to describe gangs of anti-conformist ruffians, often made up of shogunless samurai, who defied social rules and conventions and protested the established order by highly unusual ways of dressing, shocking hairdos, and strange facial hair, flamboyant clothing, and they would wear women's kimonos and cloaks. They would carry elaborately decorated swords, and they were known for being violent and rude. And the kabuki is often translated as slanted, tilted, eccentric, extraordinary, or outside the bounds of common sense, and mono means people. So these rebels aren't the people who started kabuki. The name came from a dancer named Okuni who imitated the costumes and makeup of the kabuki mono of her times. And the original performance form was called Kabuki Odori of Izumo no Okuni. But kabuki continued to develop and change over 100 years by taking in entertainments, fashions, and adjusting to a series of strict rules and regulations, then by forming families and troops, and the changes in some ways were fluid and great, and essentially, kabuki can best be described as a spirit that prevailed since kabuki was born. Okay, so I'm just gonna move forward through a couple of things and then we'll talk about my work. Some of the major changes that happened with kabuki is originally started in dry riverbeds, and they were performed for like everyday people. They were used to tell stories of like everyday life, but this is where some of the sex and violence came in, is that the women formed the troops, and they would often prostitute themselves after the performances. And then they started to build competing troops, and that's how they created kabuki families. And at a certain point, the entertainment became quite popular, and the merchant class, which at this time during the Tokugawa era, even though they were making more money than most of the shogunates, they were sort of a low class, and they invested in these families and this entertainment, and they kind of enjoyed this body, raucous, sexually progressive, violent form. And but then slowly, once it became a popular form, the government came in or people came in and restricted, women couldn't do it anymore. So young men did it, and then young men prostituted themselves, and eventually it became a form that was an all-male form. And once it then became popular, then these male performers who also started building these families started to develop very specific gestures called kata that were marked, that they became famous for their kata. And each family, when you learn kabuki, you learn it from the people in your family. So every role is passed down body to body. And a lot of times, even now, I don't know where the memory comes in, but in contemporary kabuki theaters, if you see a famous kata, they'll shout the name of the originator of that kata, if you did a great job or something. And so a lot of the images, I have all these images. That's me, that's my show. So these are the wood blocks. So a lot of these wood blocks are kind of images of these famous kata, or this is a mie, or also called an omori, which is a frozen moment where your face is frozen. There's also wood blocks of, I think this is actually Jimmy Smits at Brooklyn College, but that's a long story. Okay, so anyway, I'm not going to talk about that performance right at this moment, but you should look it up, it's interesting. Okay, so anyhow, the reason all of this stuff is interesting to me comes back to how can I and why can I do this form? And I'm interested in kabuki, first of all, because I lived in Japan for a long year, and it's an incredibly aesthetically pleasing and exciting form. Like when you're in the theater and you see how the music and the movements are bound together, and this history of specificity that reveals so much, even though, even if you can't understand the words, or even if you speak Japanese, you won't understand all the words because it's an old language. But I'm always interested in how you can be in dialogue with things, like that something isn't closed off to us because we're not of that family, or we're not something that, there's a way in where we can address some of the questions. So I started to think about how do I find masters? What would my master be? Like, I can't learn kabuki from a master, and I'm not going to imitate something, like watch a video and imitate, which is actually what Jimmy Smits did, by the way. they watched a video, and then they recorded the music. So I was like, how do I do that? And I sort of went back to the history and the kabuki mono, and this idea that it was a sort of radical theater at one point, and a theater for social change, whether or not they called it that. And I decided with my company to make our masters like punk rock and hardcore artists. And also we were sort of looking at language, and we were thinking of like early American films, like a little, like where the language had a sort of speed and a tempo and a rhythm that we just absorbed. So what we did with our company, we worked with a composer, and you'll hear the music, I'll show some footage, is that we essentially scored the entire piece in what's called 300 boxes, and we made each actor had to choose like a few artists, like Iggy Pop or Fugazi or the Slits and all these artists who they learned exact movements from. But it was footage, so something like the Germs would have a movement that was like, but it's obviously just captured on video. This isn't a repeated movement, but we took things captured on video and marked them as repeated movements, like as codified movements, and we learned them in each step as something that was repeatable, so that no movement in the entire show was not a repeated movement that we learned somewhere. And then we sort of looked at all, if you learn about kabuki, there's so many interesting ways that each of the moments are described. Like there's this mie is, I actually have the name of it, but These are called miés, which are these frozen moments where the actors stop in a kind of, they don't totally paralyze, but they stop in a facial expression. And this one is called ebegare no mie, which is a prawn-shaped pose in which the kneeling woman bends over backwards, her sound curving, threatened by someone standing over her. And there's many of these miés. Hepari no mie is when two or more actors perform a mie in conflict with one another. So this is just like a mie, which is like a general mie, which sort of shows who your person is. And then this is a hepari no mie. First, one actor does it, and then the other actor responds in kind, and it's their like relationship. And then this is the ebegare no mie. So we used all of these kind of rules, but then we also trained in these movements, which I'm just going to show you a quick video from Fugazi. We have sound. Tons and tons of footage like this. But I'm just going to show you, I'll skip one thing for a minute, how this appears in the show. You're going to see this.
I've never seen this bad sleeve before. I remember the woman's costume very well.
Preston Sturges films. That's why the comment about Morgan's Creek, because it comes from a film called The Miracle of Morgan's Creek. But it just like rolls into the narrative. And then there's this moment here, which is this is the maid, and she's revealing like that she knows about this affair. And I'm just gonna turn this on for a minute and I'm gonna show you where the source material comes from. But it's essentially like responding to Nina Hagen. So I'll just show this briefly because it's hard to understand because of the recording. This recording, this is like 2007. It was hard to record video for theater in 2007. But actually NHK recorded this video for a documentary they did on the show. But I'm just going to show you briefly this. Hardcore punk rock, you'll see all of these interesting ways that the kind of idea of the kabuki mono and the punk rocker like are tied together. And if you were to watch the whole show, you'd see the way we're sort of trying to learn from these vocal inflections. And the other thing I didn't mention is we had a live 4-piece band, two drum, well you can, oh that's not our band, 2 drummers, a keyboardist, and a guitarist. And the band and the performers were constantly responding to each other. Like their music was scored, and it was scored in these boxes, but they were responding to each other. I'm just going to show 2 more clips and then short clips. One of them is I just want to talk about how we used Preston Sturges, and the reason is I kept trying to get my actors to learn vocal inflections. And I would give them source material, but it was difficult from them. So I started to make them memorize word for word scenes to kind of reteach ways to use language. And so we had to memorize things. And then once we started memorizing them, I realized, like, I went through all the Preston Sturges movies, and I actually just put the text throughout the entire play, just to like help support the narrative. Heroes, and I like the idea of making the main character, who's also in some way, a Preston Sturges like hero. So, computer.
And shameful. Do you remember when we used to come here in the cool of the evening?
Naturally.
Oh, I thought maybe you'd forgotten. So much can happen in a year.
So much can happen in a day.
I suppose so. Were you happy to see me?
Happy is not the word for it.
Oh, excuse me. Did you ever think of me in Guadalcanal?
No.
Oh, I guess that's a pretty busy place.
Yes, so. I thought of you in other places, though.
Where?
Just other places. I thought about you every night, every morning, and every afternoon. Every girl I saw reminded me of you. And every flower wanted to sing you.
I'm so glad. Even though it can only be a memory now. Do you remember when we cut our initials in the tree?
Naturally.
They're still there.
Why wouldn't they be?
They'll always be there.
Unless something happens to the tree.
Oh, I never allow that.
You're better off to chop the tree down and forget me for good.
You may be wrong with me, I know, to kill myself before my husband's sword can strike. But let me vindicate myself in this way. Forgive me, please. This is my atonement.
Okay, so, and then basically this person, and there's some other footage of a few, there's several of us in the main, we all worked on this show. We actually worked on this show for 2.5 years. Because it's a lot. It looks kind of wild and crazy, but it was so specific. And it took us a really long time to build the vocabulary, and also it's scored all the way through, and it meant the musicians had to rehearse with us. So we developed it in parts, and then by that time and also we changed a lot of names. So the name of this talk is Isobe You Gay Man, or Hisoge You Gay Man. And one of the characters, who is a trans man, played it with his chest bound and didn't wear a shirt, and that was Hisoge You Gay Man. And then like this guy's name is He Could Kill You, which was I forget his actual name, like Hiko Karu or something, and we just changed it to He Could Kill You. And some of that was just to be playful, and also for the people just to really attract the characters. And the guy who she has an affair with is called Get It On. And it was just, so we had this total rigor to the project, but also constantly play. And at a certain point, I was like, I can't rehearse this long ever again for anything, because it becomes so precious. So the queer people in the group and I got together and decided we're going to make a live lesbian serial that's also going to be episodic, but we're only going to rehearse it twice and then put it on. And we wrote, and so we started to write the serial and conceive of it as we were in performance for this in New York. And the serial is now having its 4th season in the museum. Okay, is that good?
To a particular frequency, and they're all mathematically adjusted. And I've turned them up. I can turn them up a tiny bit more, but if you will spend the next 2 minutes, if that's okay, just like a minute or two, where people can go and experience them and then come back. sound and experiencing, and I'll talk a little bit. I'll turn it down a little bit. Study No and Ichigenkin, which is a one-string koto, and I studied different koto schools for 25, 30 years, and also tea ceremony and a number of Japanese arts. And one thing I really felt about synthesizing some of this information is that a lot of the knowledge was very much orally based and passed down from a master, and I have studied with amazing masters. And the learning process was so much through the body, and it was imitation of the master, but on a very deep level of the body. And in this sense, I don't, sorry for being binary in any kind of way, but in terms of not, in terms of the other ideas, perhaps with rational thought, and you have to kind of overcome the body in order to regain some rational ideas and learning about the world. But this other way was so much, the body was the method or kind of the pathway or the means of actually gaining knowledge. And so with all of those years of background in mind, the ideas of the chairs and of the body, experiencing the body through these vibrating sounding chairs. So I'm going to, I guess you can read this. I'm going to read some excerpts from this piece that was actually originally started last summer, actually before all the Trump business, and then it's had different ways of moving. One was a part of the Pauline Oliveros Memorial, and with her, she was a very close colleague and mentor of mine, and really talked about listening and different ways of listening. And listening also with your whole body rather than just your ears, for example, and how to experience the acousmatic and the acoustic space, and thinking about sound and these things in this kind of way. And it really led to this idea of that the vagina is the third ear for me. So I kind of recently have developed this theory, and it's going to be published in this German music a publication called Kunstmusik, and so I'll be reading some excerpts of that. What would and I guess sitting on each one of these chairs, each one is a different frequency, and we do so much sitting in our contemporary life that part of it is. I talk about that in a little bit. See. What would an ear look like without the bony cartilage? The ear, with its bony pleats, strongly resembles the fleshy contours of the vagina, with slightly messy folds that flap. Like Derrida's invagination, our language and experience hold unceasing instability. Genital vaginal folds and flaps create a layered and labyrinth topography for listening, perceiving, and feeling. The third ear modality is epistemological premise, whereby the vagina, rich in nerve endings, is a site for perception, a conceptual device that hovers within a literary and historically constructed mythological landscape, an invention that interrupts the mirrored binary symmetry of the pelvic body's two eyes, hands, and legs. Rather than a dialectic, the vaginated ear conjures a trialectic, wherein this multimodal geometric triangle of the body, the senses and the transcendental are aligned. So in other words, the vagina creates this other kind of plane. So our ears actually are orality is highly complex. When we turn this way, our ears are doing this mathematical analysis based on milliseconds, multi-milliseconds of where something is located in space. So actually, the vagina adds this whole other kind of vertical plane, if that makes any sense. How odd is it that to have an organ of one's body that has been problematized and historically isolated from the rest of one's body. Let me actually, sorry, I'm going to skip over to the part where I talk about sitting all the time. Okay. Vibration and sound. The vaginated folds extends itself to the world from down under. An ear that not only hears but feels, touches. Vibration travels further than sound. As a denizen in contemporary life, I find myself sitting down on hard resonant surfaces during much of the day for many diverse activities. I consider myself to be a virtuoso sitter, for I practice sitting innumerable hours in front of my computer, waiting several times a day for the New York MTA subway in Manhattan, and subsequently getting into the subway car and sitting down again, sitting on hard wooden benches, sitting on a bench practicing a musical instrument, sitting in a concert hall listening to a concert or a new media performance, sitting in classrooms, sitting composing music, sitting writing this essay. Later in the evening, sitting down again to get groceries, lifting weights in the gym. I am still sitting. And this happens day after day, year after year, and describes a condition I suspect is not so different from my friends and colleagues. I safely estimate that human beings who lived many millennium ago were not sitting down nearly so much, but rather standing, hunting, gathering, squatting, etc. If our sitting time on a graph is exponentially high, so are the metrics of the presence of vibrating surfaces that are excited by the ubiquitous motors generating pressure waves, whether from planes, refrigerators, or coffee grinders. Bone conduction and air conduction meet and mingle from a sitting position all day, a condition our ancestors could not imagine. So I've come to wonder, are there any physiological or evolutionary benefits to be gained from so much sitting? We are well aware of the negatives. The lack of physical movement would result in weight gain, obesity, and concomitant diseases. Is there a positive side of this contemporary condition that we have found ourselves in? Is it possible we could be developing slow and imperceptible changes towards a more finely tuned and keen sensitivity, a heightened level of awareness in our perineal and vaginal region? All this sitting engages the multimodality of sensory perception. If one is sitting on a chair, the vaginal region is also in close contact with the chair, with the resonance of the vibrations of the outside world in turn vibrating through the chair, our skin, organs, bones, and general body mass. We are already aware the vagina has a concentration of nerve endings, and this distribution in and around the vagina is very diverse and cannot be mapped predictably, as no women's neurological pathways are identical. So the idea is that it's a new way of perceiving and a potential site for perception. I talk a little bit about the actual history of the idea of the vagina, which of course is very politicized and highly. This is Falloppio, and he did a lot of anatomical drawings, and he was actually the one who named a lot of the fallopian tubes, and he did a lot of research into the cochlear, and he named the cochlear. He also named, let's see, I think I do have a list. There he is again. And he worked on corpses, and so he worked on all these dead bodies, and he discovered a lot of parts of the body, and so he named himself the vagina, the clitoris, the cochlea, and the placenta, both from the reproductive systems and also from the ear. So also making this connection between the ear and the vagina. I have this essay that I wrote. I'm not going to go through it now because it's all different various ways that there are these connections, science and literary connections and mythological connections of these areas of the body. But he named these, and also there's different fallopian tubes that exist from both the cochlear and reproductive organs, and that are named after him. Let's see. So this piece was also done at the Park Avenue Armory, and you can actually see Lemon and Dan here from last year. And it's actually what's interesting about this piece is there's a real social interaction that happens when people sit down on the chairs. Originally, it was specifically about the vagina, and there are these vagina inserts here that took sound, and the idea was that vagina was not just a passive organ, but also gave sound and received sound, and taking the sounds of the body and then amplifying them and putting them into the mix for people to hear. So these are silicone, non-toxic inserts that can be put into the vagina, and then they are put into the mix. So that was one of the performances. You can see Suzanne Cusick, who's a feminist theorist, actually participated in that, and there's also an actress and a writer and a number of well-known artists of different types. And it was interesting because for this performance, we didn't quite have enough vaginal inserts, and everybody wanted one, because in other ones, everybody was shy and they didn't want to do it. But this one, you can see the wires going to them, and they have it very discreetly going up their pants and stuff, so you wouldn't know. And then, but it was interesting because the different performances, the people would respond really differently. And then at the Park Avenue Armory, that was different because this vaginal part was removed, and they became chairs that people experienced. And in that way, it became a very social space where people would sit down and they would comment. And also, Carol Young, who's the partner of Paulina Oliveras, wrote a poem for us called Vibrating Women. And so she did live readings of this. And the term vibration is the basis of sound, of course, and it's just used so much. So I'm trying to think of other words to use in my pieces besides vibration. So, it's just been so used in the 60s, of course, and it's so ubiquitous in our language. So I'm thinking I have other ideas of alternative strategies, so I don't have to use the word vibration or sound in pieces. But of course, it's experiencing this, and they're experiencing it together, and they're talking about it, and it becomes something larger. Their own particular individual personalities and histories and personal narratives come into, and memory, of course, become part of it. And this was at Prentice at Columbia, and people need a place to sit down, so they sit down and sometimes they experience it in different ways. And this is part of the other talk, which I know that we're short on time, so I don't know how we're doing. I get 3 minutes? Okay. Let's see. We'll do the questions later. I think it's interesting to work with everyday objects, although I am working with a designer to work with a custom built chair that deals with some of these same questions and issues, but on a slightly different pathway of thinking about it. So, let's see what else can Well, I think we'll have a lot more to talk about when we have questions, because it's a real social piece, and then we can answer more questions. So thank you.
Should I turn off the projector? Huh? Should I turn off the projector?
Yeah.
Hello. It was Mickey who invited me, and we had a talk. And I said something about history, something about. Thank you. The sound of this. I said something about swallowing, And I said something about spitting. And 3 days later, I found out it became a title of today. Thank you. In a very strange way, I say strange things, and I make strange noise. Swallowing and spitting, maybe not spitting so forcefully, but how do you say? Not crying loud, but having some tears and nose to lips and drooling all get mixed up. So Mickey had also took my workshop during the platform last year, which was organized by Dance Space Project, and I had a 6 weeks marathon in which I performed 4 weeks pretty much every day, and I had many different events, including exhibitions and installations, and movie series, and talk shows, and performances, and I'm forgetting something. Oh yes, book club, and the installations and guest artists curating, one of which was workshop in a church sanctuary of St. Mark's Church. If you don't like to participate, you can watch. Usually I don't let you watch because it's really not fair to the people who is participating. So you have a choice. You can go out and come back later, or you can watch. But I would really like you to participate. If at all possible, I make it very easy for you. In Japan, there's a proverb, 踊るバカとなんだっけ? 踊るバカいて踊らぬバカ. What was the precise words? 踊るバカと踊らぬバカ. 同じバカなら踊らない。song. Okay, I translate. So if to dance is stupid, but not dance is also stupid. So why not dance? Which I always keep it in my mind, because often people don't think of me as a dancer, and often people have a very strong feeling. I mean, they don't hate me necessarily, but they do have a problem of calling my work as a dance, and I totally get it. So I don't argue against it, but there's a big area where we call it art, and there's a big area we call it a poem. There has to be a big range we can call it a dance. And because I like this proverb, this is one of the reasons I call myself a dancer. Am I getting too close to the mic? I'm getting a vibration. Do you hear me well? I mean, I have a very big voice. I can be comfortable without this. Let me know. So I want to talk to you about my coming Metta engagement. It's been about 2 years ago when I first was approached by Met performing art curator who knew about Eikon Koma's work. I said, I'm resting Eikon Koma. Could I do it alone? And Koma was fine with that. I consulted with him to make sure he was fine. There's a stories behind of this, but I'm not going in. And then came a performer, which is a whole different thing. We call ourselves coming from Black Box, which is basically theater. I left the theater for the sort project I'm doing. I am not going back to theater for any foreseeable near future. But I fully admit and I embrace the fact I come from theater. But very early on, from age 20, I was already performing in the museums and galleries and outdoors and parks because we couldn't often get interested. So if a producer says, would you like to perform here outdoors? We often said yes. But it was not until much later in our lives where we have become very aware, and let's say, let me drop we, because I want to quickly go to my solo project. I have become very aware, theater has become expensive, it becomes uncomfortable to a certain race, certain economic rank of the people. I think 3 times before I want to buy the ticket nowadays. So I have become extremely grateful to the presenters and curators who invite me and they can come to a places where people really don't have to pay hefty price. I don't like the feeling of people can pay price, but I don't really like the feeling of strange question, was it worth it? You know, and I feel like people should be able to appreciate it or dislike it as what it is, not to compare to the price they have paid. So when I began my solo project in 2014, I have decided, as I have always done in my life, to make the money not to show. I don't mind people paying, I don't mind I paying, but I don't want to show money. I don't want to see money. I would like, my mind is freer if I don't have to think about money. So I asked my very good friend, Bill Johnston, who is sitting there, knowing I never have to pay him. I have fully engaged my sons and my husband to help me because I don't have to pay them. And that was true with my kids since age 4. So by doing this, I take a lot of good ideas out because it's expensive. And I'm like stuck with cheap ideas. And I like it. So it goes against a little bit of traditional Japanese art, which had been Boni. Am I saying your name? What is Boni? No. Brooke. Sorry, I'm really terrible with the name. Brooke had been talking about traditional performing art and how cool and how interdisciplinary, and I do all agree. But having growing up there, and I also talked with Mia, but like me growing up in Japan, I've always thought Japanese traditional art are very much part of the emperor system. There's an amazing, supposed to be amazing person, often guy, on top, and it's basically like this. At the same time, there are amazing artists, there's amazing production, there are beauty, and the master works. But I was not going to be involved. So for me, the history really is our human history, long time. So my arm shouldn't be this long, right? It should be. And I don't take this on, but I can do this like however, because that's what human history has been. National history. Goes up, crumbles down, do bad things, regret. My history. My parents were married 1945, August 10th. That is 4 days after Hiroshima, and that's 1 day after Nagasaki, and 5 days before Japan had officially announced that being defeated by the war. So it always has been so close to my mind, not that only, my parent generation came from the war, my uncles and aunts, all that generation. And I come from the post-war Japan with democratic constitution that Japanese occupation people had drafted. And probably the best constitution in my mind in the world and in the history. Precisely because those people who drafted the constitution had gotten throughout, actually my friend Beard Gordon, had got into the GI Jeep and had driven through the burned down Tokyo. And went to like 18, 19 half-burned libraries and had gotten every possible law and constitution book and had looked into this and took every good part out of it. So that's the behind of the story. So I grew up with that constitution. When I was 3 years old or so, when I was very, very small, my mother and I would walk Ueno, Japan, Tokyo's downtown, very fast, because there were many wounded soldiers sitting like this, begging, had a all white wear, and a white box for begging money. But my mother, with a small person, she would like drag me and walk very fast, right? We know why, right? But I, as a child, being dragged, my height was in the same eye line with those veterans. This was very clear memory of me. There's a sense of violation. He wanted, often men, they're all men, the way I remember them, wanted to catch my eyes because they couldn't often catch grown-ups' eyes. And there was a sense of a little bit of, probably this is not true, but I felt there's a sense of maliciousness, of blaming me as a child, because her own mother is trying to get out of that side. So that was a very much my sense of my body is connected, my eyes are connected to the history. As I grew up, I read many of the authors and movie makers who were child, teenagers, grown up during the war. My sense dealing with history is how do I swallow somebody else's life as a relationship? That my life is not only enriched, but cannot be without. So such a person that I have befriended, Nagasaki atomic bomb victim, Kyoko Hayashi. And one day, as we became very, very close friends, I just decided everywhere I go, she comes with me. It was not until this year she passed away. So I feel like I've been moving around with her in here, for 10 years. And that is how I live with history. So when 3 of us met earlier, to prepare for today's event, it was very amusing to me. Performing history can have such a different meaning to not only to us but to the scholars, depending on you're in the music, depending on you're in the dance. But to me, it really is how I am a part of the history and how certain history event hurts me terribly, and certain history event that I feel extremely responsible. Having also grown up as a post-war child, I hate athletic events. I hate when people move together, right, left, right, left. I really don't understand with the history that how Japan had behaved during the war. The teachers were willing to lead us right, left, right, left. Miki Miki, Miki. Entire my life, I don't want to deal with a person who tells me this. If somebody tells me this, I might look another way. And I will stay here. Until somebody will regret. Why did I tell Echo? So this is what I'm doing in Met, November 5, 12, 19th. They expected only me to perform in one place. Perhaps they expected me to perform on the Fifth Avenue, because that's like Met. But I did notice the Met has 3 buildings in a portfolio: Cloister, Breuer, and Breuer. I have a history. I was there 1997 for full mouth, naked, performing all the hours of the museum hours. Okay, that's not anymore so strange at this point, but in 1997 it was strange. So now it's part of the Met because Whitney had moved downtown. I also decided Bill and I have shot them by now 15,000 pictures. And usually we only show in the exhibition 100, 150. That's a big exhibition. We are bound by wall space. So I have this rescue project that I want to rescue the kind of photos that never get shown. And those are the photos that I don't really look perfect. I don't. But that's me. So it will not be his selection, it will be my memory. And by extending this video, which you just saw a little bit today, I am making 7.5-hour video, which is like knitting each photo and making a big sweater like Madison Square Garden. And nobody's going to see the whole thing, but I'm going to let them know through the program notes, through the interviews, through any way possible, there's a 7.5-hour video. As if it could mean something. It might not. But I feel there are certain ways I can perform, but there are certain ways I can prepare to the performance. That preparation is my act of practice. Can you come to see me and cheer me? I'm performing all day, pushing the cart, being a manual laborer. I'm going to stain Met walls. But they're very restrictive. Understand why? Where I can stain. And I have to keep saying it's metaphorically. And I'm not only staining Met, I'm staining my costume. I'm staining my body. Thank you. Delicious movement. Teaser. But usually when I teach, I teach either 2 semesters or 3 weeks in a residency. I teach a lot because it is my political job. But today is a teaser, so perhaps not too political. Do I look political? Do I look historical? Do I look precious? you. My parents got married 1935, August 10th. However, I am not 72 years old. I'm 65. Do the easy math. I was born 1952. The year American occupation ended. One day I asked why it took so long. 7 years, and I'm the first child. My father said, so many people are living in a small place. We couldn't do what could result you until we can go somewhere alone. So perhaps I was 7 years making with the desires that did not materialize. Time existed before me. That's it. Okay? So, if you are not very peculiar, be on the floor everywhere. You go home and take a shower. If you are very peculiar, you can use the sheet. Okay? But that's a body loves to move. If you are lost, think about in the night. As you sleep, body moves. Hair grows, nails grow. You get older, more wrinkles. We are moving. When I say it, it's very interesting. At the same time, your body has carried the egg that your mother had from the day she was born, and that egg was also coming from your grandmother from the day she was born. Eggs are history, not Siemens. They are short-lived, 3 days at most. Eggs. Think about how body wasn't body before. Think about fingers weren't fingers before. Could have been a wing. The palm of your hand, we humans are very similar in our colors, in the palm of our hand. We may have a different color everywhere else. Back of your feet will have a similar color. We used to crawl, we used to run. Feel you happen to have 5 fingers. It could have been 6. It could have been 4. Feel water in your body. When you can't move big, you move small. Distance changes. Small movement can take time, and you walk, you crawl, don't skip and hop. And find a way on the, as an introduction of the introduction, I'm going to let you calm down. For the reason I said, I never want to say in a classroom, stop. I always say calm down. So you take gradual time to finish whatever you are enjoying or disliking. I don't have to know either way. Just gradually stop. And in a very sense of individual comfort, can you use your own judgment to come to sit up? Open your eyes. I actually forgot to tell you to close the eyes, but there was no complaint, so you are doing fine. I think this is amazing. Most of the people are participating. I like it. And I have to small finger going somewhere when other fingers might not. Teacher say, look to your right. No. But why? Yes, I don't know. No. I don't want to cut. Relax. Why you are so slow? Because there has to be a reason for certain things, for a certain person, but not always. At least, said, this sounds good. I've been busy helping others. Why don't I do my own thing? Helpful. I can come to say hi to my friend. I know her. And shoulder. And even we don't have any fun joint here. You know, just because we don't. That doesn't mean we cannot think about it. So I often in my dancing, I think about joy that I don't have. It liberates me not to be too caught up with where I am. Okay? Right? So now we have a lot of very liberal-minded people. So be aware when you do this, this is called body grip. Okay? So that's why you can do this here, but not here. Ready? Okay, good. Alright, so I trust you, and if you trust yourself, close your eyes. And if you don't trust yourself, you can small open, but don't shake. And feel free to kind of spread out more. Okay, this is called one hand moving around. Help yourself. This can be a sound piece. Because your perspiration goes up. By working with one hand only, you are making your body not symmetrical. Our body being symmetrical is alive. Our hand, as one, is alive. Your hand being this big and always so is alive. Different distances between some fingers. Your fingers. Without going to a bathroom and washing your hand, water dripping. Small sweat. Water. History is a time. Time is a river. It runs from upstream to downstream. But we don't always have to be on the same speed going to downstream. We can argue, we can network, we can grab a stone and not go, or chat between the possibilities. Linger where you like to linger, but not stop. Move on where you like to move on. Wrist has been helping you. I'm going to stay here. Your fingers or elbow or shoulder. And don't do it all at once. Your arms. And keep raising. Come, come, going up. We are going up. Keep doing that. Keep doing that with hesitation. How stupid. We are doing this together. But then slowly open your eyes and look at each other's armpit. Your arms, fingers, palms swinging, but you're saying hi to each other by your armpit. Hello, dear. And when you feel that is enough, whole world has seen your armpit, bring it down. Since it's a teaser, I can stop here, but I'm not. And what happened 9 months before your body was born? And how it has been for your body. A person who is watching, you can move around your subject. You can zoom in as long as you are very discreet. Where are you watching? Feel. Where are you invited to watch? What is your appetite for that body? Don't look at whole body, only look at details. Look at between the body parts. Look at and you are hiking, not jumping around. You are slowly walking over this strange person's body's landscape. Watching shoulder, like a boulder, watching boulder, watching wrinkles, like imagining going down to the valley. Imagine the place, this place, after this body dies. She is not here. When she is not here, you remember she, them were here. And now zoom in, eating the rolls gradually. The people who used to move, slowly open your eyes, look around. Don't jump up and begin to watch. This person whose name you might not know, whose countries where she grew up, you might not know. And of course you can look away, but don't let her feel it. Don't let your friend feel it. Discreetly, you can see the part of the room, but make sure you're supporting by looking, by noticing, by minding the details. Details makes body. and watching people, don't jump your eyes, places, your glasses. You walk over the landscape. You linger and you notice more details, shadows, strange places in a body that people don't usually use in greeting. Armpit for one. Back of your knee for the other. Under a chin, behind of a ear. You can watch it move. Continue zoom in until finally it touches your partner's body. Close your eyes, join the body, two of you be together as close contact as possible. And do your own thing, not aggressive, not invasive. Both of your eyes closed, both bodies be there, communicating or ignoring, or enjoying the both possibilities. Your bodies keep moving. And each of you as a pair, temporary pair, you decide without talking, somehow one or you, both of you open your eyes and meet the eyes and say, hi. But you can take time to get to the place.
You were really good too. I was trying to get up
You make a group of two pairs, 4 people, and then just socialize, talk about
up to start.
You should try it. This one's strange.
But of course, we have to give time for the discussions and then your feelings. So I only want to say, usually I teach at like minimum 3 hours a class, right? And then what will happen next? Each one will take longer time. There's a lot of small discussion group. I change the dynamic by like 4 people to 6 people, which is very different, right? And I know I say this because many of you teach. So what happens now is, which I don't do, I'm skipping it for the time. I will go each group, and each group, some of them, and I don't assign leaders before the discussion, so they have to kind of come up with without talking. So somebody will say, so what did you find from this group? But what you heard, instead of what you said, or what you think. So I switched the gear from I, which was happening, to, oh, someone in my group said, which was strange, or I never thought about that, or it was so much articulate, more articulate than I thought. So I changed the gear to use the body as sort of like a conduit. Because especially for those of you who teach, we always know certain people speak up and certain people don't. And this way, certain people becomes more of the reporter, but you are reporting because you are like responding to somebody's ideas, whether it's new or agreed or disagreed. So I think it's the democracy of a body and a sense of hesitation as an aesthetic, as morale. So how to avoid injuries to each other, how to avoid amazingly dynamic room, if it has a risk, how to assess risk, right? At the same time, how to use each of us as to extend in a way of helping each other, and you also get a lot out of your own time and space. Okay? So I'm finishing now, and then we're moving into a discussion, right? And you can find me online, if you have any questions or something, feel free to. Or just join me in my next workshop, whatever that is. Thank you.
Deals with art and politics and contemporary Japan, and she has recently produced an event commemorating the six-year anniversary of the Fukushima disasters at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, in collaboration with Eiko Ohtake and William Johnston. I'll quickly introduce the other people here. Katie Brewer-Ball, and maybe if you guys can wave and say your name. Is a writer and performer with a teaching appointment in theater and African American studies at Wesleyan University. Peter Eckersall is a dramaturg and professor of theater and performance studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. Karen Shimokawa, over here. Is a critical race theorist and chair of the Performance Studies Department at NYU. William Johnston is a photographer and collaborator with Eiko's, as she mentioned earlier, in the Body and Places series, and professor of history at Wesleyan University. And Tyron Grillo is a critic, translator, and postdoctoral fellow at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute here at Columbia. Thomas Lusser is a cultural anthropologist and associate professor of East Asian Studies at NYU. And Eli Hisama is professor of music and feminist theory of popular experimental music. Okay, so I'm gonna pass the mic to Marilyn.
Well, this is hardly know what to say after a movement workshop. I mean, some of these considerations seem now a little bit heady or academic, but that's where you're supposed to be, or at least some of us here are supposed to be in this role of scholars, and there's going to be a writing project. So I'm going to return to some of these themes. With the idea of swallowing history or drooling history, spitting history, letting it leak out somehow, and what Eiko has said is, in some ways it becomes, in that kind of embodiment, it becomes something else, something beyond history, and it's some of the workshop, what we've been doing with the movement, it's a form of temporality that seems to exceed or go beyond something we could call history in that sense. But that, that's something we can think about. I should say that I just want to quickly say that I didn't really produce that and have anything to do with the production of the event at the cathedral as a commemoration of Marshall. I was just a small little person, and part of the discussion. But Eiko and Bill did so much of the work, and it was really their work. So again, despite these remarks, we are being called to think about something called performance in relation to history, and the history of performance and the performance of history, and the articulation of those two categories, well, in this case, particularly in relation to Japanese performance. I mean, that is partly what's going on here, and maybe Japanese American performance in performance contexts. And so many cross-articulations are at stake, including these categories of tradition and innovation that have been brought up, and the differences between different national cultural contexts, different languages, different genres, and also these different disciplinary formations, which we have represented. We have representatives of so many different disciplines here. And it struck me that, and brought up even more palpably in the movement workshop, that the place of space, bodies and places and spaces and spacing, and again, embodiment in the full sense of that word is charged with this notion of history. And in that sense, performing history is becoming clear to me. And maybe that category of temporality. I'm an anthropologist, and so there's a certain kind of embodiment that's built into that practice, at least conventionally, where you go and you do field work, and so you move your body into a different context, and you form a kind of embodied relationship to people and conversation and other forms of encounter. And then, you write that out. Classically, it's called an ethnography, and that is supposed to be some kind of trace structure or narrative of those sets of encounters. So there's a kind of performance of being there, having been there, and which the writing can be seen to embody. So I was just reflecting on that, and anthropology is a certain dimension of that. And I think, Miki was asking or wanting to think about, well, what would be the performance of a particular disciplinary formation? Do we efface those differences between what we normally think of, or maybe commonly think of as performance, and these disciplinary, or if we want to call them academic or scholarly writing practices as performative? I just want to bring up quickly 2 points about this question of history, and of course, one point might be, or one category or set of reflections might ask, which history are we talking about? Whose history? History for whom? What history? Or not to mention what is history? And the question of narrative or stories that always come up when we think about history. And histories, plural forms. Histories of the body, of particular bodies that get performed. My history, or personal history, which might not really be something called history with a capital H. So we have all these small recitations and performances and micro-histories. But always history, I think, implies some kind of narrative structure, or recitation or something. And the second question or category or set of considerations might have to do with audience and performance context, particularly when we move to think about Japanese traditional theater and its place, or Japanese and American histories, how they've been crossed, and who would be the audience for some of these performances, particularly in the United States, in the context of these kind of dominant historical narratives that we all inhabit, these different forms of oppression, or forms of exoticism or Orientalism, or what, like typical, I don't know what that would be, but American audiences might be taking from some of these performances marked as Japanese, or having Japanese traditional features in them, and displaying this tension between something called tradition, and I often think of it as tradition and modernity, not simply tradition and innovation. But I guess let's just say there's always, to me, when in the United States, because of this entangled history and this history of domination, you might say, there's always an indexing of global history and the politics of the past, and as April very much has talked about, very much including World War II and the question of the nuclear, and the relationship of U.S. to Japan and Asia, and that whole historical context that is constantly being evoked in the American performance context. So that would be something I want to think about in terms of performing these kinds of performances that might index Japaneseness in the American context. Of course, our performers have gone far beyond this kind kind of narrow vision of history, but by bringing it to consciousness. Okay, so with maybe these are my thoughts in mind, and we had a number of questions for reflection, and I just want to mention a couple of them. What can the practice of embodied performance bring to historical research? So there is this question, I think, motivating the workshop about, it is about history and historical research, and what can this practice of embodied performance bring to historical research, like we just experienced? And how can historical research inform performance practice of its theory? So we might say the opposite of the kind of dialectical relationship there. So I want to start with those, a few others that were in the planning stages that were given to us, but also, we'll open it up to different kinds of questions as long as time allows. And I think I'd like to direct this pair of questions to Bill Johnston, since I think he's the only real historian, so to speak. And he's a professor in the Department of History at Wesleyan University, and of course he's also a historian of Japan. But as you know, he's also the photographer, an amazingly accomplished photographer, devoted photographer of Eiko's Body in Places series and other performances she's given. And so he's probably also seen more of her performances in many context than any of us. So, Bill, can you start out by just saying something about how these embodied performances in places, particularly the ones you've seen in Eiko, have influenced or shaped your vision of history or historical research? One. And on the other hand, how has your work as a historian informed what you see as a photographer's performance? And Eiko might want to chime in too.
Marilyn, thank you very much. Those are excellent questions. Before I address them, I'd like to give a little bit of history. And specifically to point out that Eiko and I started to teach together. Our initial connection was one of co-teaching. It was a course on the atomic bomb, and Eiko pointed out as I came in today that apparently this building, I don't know for sure, but I know for sure that Pupin Hall and Schemerhard Hall were the two places on the Columbia campus where the Manhattan Project was actively pursued, including a cyclotron in the basement of Pupin Hall, I believe it was, which is still highly radioactive apparently, according to researchers. But that it was our course on Japan and the atomic bomb that brought us together originally. And also to point out that what we have experienced today is in a kind of microcosm, the experience of our course, as it's turned into, in that what we love to do is to create a sense of community, which I just see having happened magically and wonderfully right here this afternoon, this evening, with all of us here in the room. I wish we could continue this, and I would love to hear from everybody to be able to speak a bit. So to get to my thoughts originally about the place of history in the three projects today, and which history, whose history, where is the audience, and I am incredibly just intrigued by all three of the performers today. Brooke, to begin with, is bringing out this history of these kabukimono, these people who were originally sort of upstart, really in-your-face kind of performers, and what they were doing at the time, and engaging with this history. So here we see historical research turning into performance itself, and flipping it around in ways that I find incredibly innovative and transformative. I mean, one of the things, as historians, what we talk about all the time, well, what is history? And in the end, it is really change over time and our understanding of change over time. And what I see happening with all three of these is that they are engaging with the past in ways that, while on the one hand they're bringing us aware, so as Marilyn points out, bringing things to consciousness, which they're all doing, while at the same time they're transforming them. So in the, Brooke, with her engagement with Kabuki and transforming it in this way, I mean, we'll in the end, every time I go back and see another Kabuki performance, I will see it differently, and thank you. Similarly with what Mia is doing, this question of the vagina, and it's to me it's fascinating because I originally got interested in the history, specifically of my research field, of looking at why did the Japanese start to study Western medicine, in particular anatomy? And it was because they saw in the fact that when something had a name, it gave people the ability to transform it and to manipulate it. And I didn't realize this bit of the history of vagina, that it goes back to Philippio. I knew this discovery of the Philippian tubes, but it doesn't mean, of course, that that part of the body wasn't there. Of course not. But what does it mean when suddenly it is given a name and transformed? And of course, what she's done is yet again transformed that, again through her own performance. And Eiko, in her addressing history and refusal to engage with so-called traditional Japanese arts, is a kind of anti-history, but at the same time engaging with history. It's a political statement, very much so. And all three of these are political statements, in that they are dealing with the ability of people to do things in certain places. It's a question of power. And that's what I see, whose history, and with what stories. And the stories are the ones that we want to pull out. As historians, what's important is that we be as thorough as possible in looking for the sources which can tell us the stories that we want to pursue. And there's good history that way, well done history, and it's thorough. It often means we encounter things that we don't expect. But at the same time, they can be the stories that speak to us now. I mean, they must be, or otherwise it's not alive. And that's what we're seeing here today, is how history very much is coming alive. And in that sense, that is also at the same time both creating and engaging with the audience. So let me stop it there. We have a lot of people with a lot of things to say, I'm sure. So if people want to pursue that further, I'm happy to, but I'd love to hear what other people have to say.
Yes, thank you. I guess I'm the immoderator, I thought. And I'll try to be moderate, in moderation. Anyone is welcome to speak at this point. I was thinking maybe I would ask Peter Eckersall, just speaking on people I kind of know pretty well, for starters. But yeah, if you have any thoughts, it could be along these lines or taking off, of course.
So, I did a lot of work on looking at the 1960s in Japan, both in the performance and in the protest movements. And I really made some fairly, obvious arguments in a way that the body is really important to everything in the 60s. Certainly, if you know anything about the performance, it's the beginning of the period that developed the Butoh performance. But it's also the beginning of a kind of ideology of the body and activism. So there's in the student protest and workers' protest movements of the 60s and early 1970s, there's, without going into too much kind of complex kind of arguments about Marx, there's a kind of rejection in a way of a certain kind of ideological perspective and a very strong emphasis on action. And on a certain level, these two come together, this talking and this doing, in a really kind of highly performative way. And I was just thinking about examples of that, and watching the works today reminded me of I guess I wanted to touch on three different moments from Japanese performance. The first one is a company that's very dear to my heart, and it's actually not a 60s company, it's a company that is active now and has been active since the 1980s. It's a company named Gekidan Kaitaisha, meaning Theatre of Deconstruction. But it's a company that operates very much with a lineage tracing back to the development of Butoh through the foundation members of that company. And there's this question of where's history in the body? Where is power in the body? And how does the body enact or interrupt or evoke certain kinds of politics? And Kaitaisha are very concerned with this. As you might gather, Theatre of Deconstruction, their work on one level is almost a kind of post-structural analysis of power. They walk around the space and they slap their bodies and they run into each other, and then they play highly kind of visceral media over the top of this, and their line is the body disappears and the body must fight back. On another level though, their process is continuous, and there is no distinction between what they might call rehearsal and performance. Everything is an ongoing process. And it is their life, this work. And so there is this idea that power operates on the body, but the body also resists through power, through a dynamic of power, through the generation of a very strong physicality. And so that was my first point, that there's this strange kind of interweaving of the idea that the body is operated on and formed by society, and that also the body forms its own kind of community, if you like. The original inheritance of kabuki, before it was cleaned up in the 19th century at the time the emperor issued a decree that it be suitable for illustrious foreigners and family groups. And so Kato comes along, and his company, they do a very kind of wild trans-historical kind of performance, which is extremely physical, but at the same time exploring these kind of myths and narratives from the past in extremely elliptical ways, but also dealing with wartime memory and so on and so forth. And so I think that experience of a company that is in a way performing an alternative history of Japan through the body is something that was resonating with me. And the third point was the discussion of money, because there's a wonderful essay from one of the magazines of the 60s written by Kato's then wife, Lin Reisei, who's an actor but also the manager of the company. And the essay is about the price of spring onions at the market, because this is a company that's essentially living in a communal structure. And the essay is a really wonderful sort of examination of the relationship between finance and performance, because it all depends on how many spring onions they can get, because that's how they flavour the miso soup, which makes their lives bearable while they're on the road walking around. They call themselves river beggars. They call themselves these itinerant, they were inhabiting this sort of history of itinerant Japanese performance.
Thank you, Peter. I'm not sure exactly how to do the timing here. We are sort of moving along. But I would just like to invite anybody from the scholar side, maybe we're going to move to the artist side very quickly, but since we're all here, I'd like to hear, there's some other questions that were, one was, what new insights can the framework of traditional Japanese performing arts in the U.S. add to existing studies about performance? And another one was, what gestural, sonic, epistemological vocabularies do tradition and historical performance practice as media offer for artists and scholars to productively engage the moment, or anything else that might strike you? And then at a certain point, we'll try to, I know we're running a little bit behind schedule, we can move to questions and real artist comments and so on. So, would anyone like to use this mic?
I just had a few very quick things that are more reactive comments than anything else. First, and these are really just realizations that came about for the power of what I was witnessing in today's performances and descriptions of those performances. So first is that performing history is also making history. There's this negative connotation sometimes, at least popularly, that performing is somehow faking it. But I think as we've seen today, performance is truly the embodiment of history because it is part of its production. So really it's participating in the formation of collective experience, as we saw in this organic community that came about today. And it also reminds us that every gesture has baggage. And in its idealized forms, history attempts to purify bodily action, but always fails because it is itself always embodied. Second, and as a translator, this is my biased opinion, but history is above all a form of translation in the same way that a performance such as those we saw today translates invisible impulses into lived experience and vice versa. And lastly, I thought that the image that Eiko-san came up with about swallowing and spitting was very appropriate, because when those actions are performed physically in tandem, part of you gets incorporated into that history. So what you swallow in its supposedly pure, unadulterated form somehow becomes tainted or influenced by your action in incorporated into your body and spitting it back out. And so in some ways it expresses the indeterminate effluvia of politics that surround us, for lack of a better term.
I'm just going to say a few things quickly. I'm just going to kind of echo back some of the things that I heard that I liked, which are starting with who are my masters. I love this question, who are my masters? And thinking about building the vocabulary. And I think one of the things that played across all three of the presentations was like this tension between rigor, play, and erotics. Like there was something that was really nice in all three around that. In Mia's, its orality is highly complex and this virtuoso sitter. I like both of those. And then I wrote down crotch-based nerve endings. But then also thinking about the vagina, the crotch, the medical vagina, you know, like thinking about all of the kind of like movements between those felt really generative to me. And then Eiko, I wrote down a couple of things, a lot of things. But one of the things around history that you said was moving around with her in here, in like both of your armpits, right? Or somewhere in your clothing, right? Sewn in. And you said, so that is performing history, right? Which I really liked. And it made me think of like two quotes, which I thought I would just also throw in there. And kind of like more cumulative than like clarifying in general. But one of them is Saidiya Hartman asks this question in an essay called Venus in Two Acts. That is, what do stories afford anyway? Like why, like history is always a story. Why do we tell them? Why do we tell these stories and how do we tell these stories? And that made me think of, Miki, you started saying the idea of Japan, and I don't know if that was like, I thought that was interesting, thinking about the idea of Japan as, you know, and as like an idea. And also a place, and also a history, and also many other things, but that word idea kind of stuck with me. And then this other thing that Tavi Nyong'o says, which is history is always performed in the present, right? Like there's no history that's not also, like you can't tell history without doing it in some way in the moment. So, and then the other thing that I had thought of was just this question of genre, because like really quickly we could say like theater, music, dance, right? I think, and especially thinking about kabuki, which does get historicized as theater, but it's also a dance form. I mean, doesn't kabuki actually translate into theater, dance, song, or something?
Yeah, song, dance, and like show, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, which so I thought that was interesting, thinking about like the kind of like genre tensions or openings across your work. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try not to repeat things that have already been said, but just thank everybody. That was amazing. So just really quickly, one thing. I think I was invited because I've thought a lot about Eiko's work, but I have lots more thoughts. But the one thing that I really was struck by was actually something that in Brooke's presentation. I'm not a Japan scholar, but because I don't know, you guess why, I often get asked to teach like world theater, and so I find myself teaching kabuki all the time, even though I know nothing about it. So I, read Oscar Rocket and all that kind of stuff, and the Mie, right? I teach, the dictionary, the encyclopedia, the Wikipedia definition of the Mie and all this stuff, and I kind of figured out what I know about it, and thinking about it really about this thing about being from the outside in, right? You learn this gesture, and this is a lot of what I have sort of absorbed about a certain kind of pedagogy of learning by imitation, right? You learn the shape and you learn the thing, and then you learn something about it from having that shape, and it does something inside your body. But when you play the Fugazi thing, I had this incredibly internal, affective sort of feel, and it made me see the Mie in a totally different way, because it was so much about like not just the shape from the outside producing a feeling on the inside, but it made me understand that actually on some level the Mie is about an outward expression of an inner affect, which is a totally different way than I've ever actually thought about it. So I guess that was very exciting to me, to learn that, to think about the sort of the affective part of
the production of the mia, right, rather than just the shape that makes somebody else feel something. I guess the only other thing I would say is that the class that I'm teaching right now is all about like history shaping the present, which is a lot of what people have been talking about, but also the ways, you know, the stories of the stories of the past that we tell not only produce the present, but produce the subject in the present, right? Who we can be is sort of shaped by what we think brought us to this moment. And in the class, we've been thinking about it a lot in terms of politics, in terms of law, in terms of, you know, all those kinds of kind of abstract concepts. But what this today really made me think about is actually the way that you feel in your body is produced by the story of the past that you come to tell. I was thinking about Mia's thing about, said, you know, I don't want to do the whole thing about the separation of the mind and the body, and you know, I'm going to talk about this. But it actually did make me think, you know, so there's always been this history of trying to separate out the mind from the body and really going with that sort of enlightenment, you know, kind of thinking about the intellect. But I immediately thought, like, actually I think we've been listening with our vagina maybe all along, but we just haven't really articulated that. And even without articulating it, listening with your vagina has actually shaped the world that you are inhabiting. We just never really acknowledge that, right? So I kind of like that idea that it just sort of makes you think differently about the knowledge that we actually have been collecting all along, but haven't put words to. So yeah, anyway, I like it, thank you.
I'll try to do this real quick. Just some real general comments, actually going back to your first comments. In a sense, I think actually Eiko best answered whose history this is, just simply human history. All history is human history.
It's a history.
But yeah, well, I'll ignore that one.
Evolutionary history. Yeah.
And therefore it almost makes sense that this is. So there's this kind of monumental quality that is always haunting history itself, that means you now know what it is. It's a category that's fixed. And there's always that risk that you end up doing that to the body itself and all the messiness that the body might open as the basis of history. And you can kind of see that in each one of these presentations. That in some ways, Kabuki, for instance, sure, it's all about rebelliousness and openness and riverbed beggars who are completely outside society, but it's also the place where gender categories get fixed for the first time, and really fixed as something close to a national sense of category. Same thing for the vagina stuff. In some ways, it's tremendously open. If I sit on that chair, am I participating in being a woman? Maybe. That's kind of cool. Well, to me, anyway. But weird. Anyway. But also that sort of tripartite quality. The third term always risks pulling back the previous two terms. In some ways, a trilectic is almost like a dialectic, and therefore pulls back the terms that you think you've surpassed. And in some ways, even with Eiko's discussion of her own personal bodily history that seems to be so apart from the imperial nationalist history, it also could end up just opposing it, and then you're stuck with your personal self versus the imperial, which reifies the imperial. So basically, that's my simple point, that the complexity that runs through all this stuff, I think, is what's really most productive and really interesting. The body's at the heart of it.
Maybe the body can never be imperialized completely.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ellie Hasama from music. So I also really, really enjoyed the 3 performances and our participation in the workshop. So I had a few thoughts about this idea of history in relation to the body as well. So all of you dealt in some ways, to me, with histories of bodies. So Mia, that was fascinating how your research informs this very live, present engagement with bodies and our bodies. And I also liked very much your slide, which we didn't talk about, but the depth, you were very clear about being inclusive. So if I can just quote from that, you wrote, oops, where'd it go? For the purposes of this essay, the term vagina will be inclusive of vagina-identified, non-normative, and queer vaginas and those that have been surgically or medically created. And for this essay, the term vagina is broadly defined and includes the inner and outer vagina, is held in common in colloquial colloquial use practices, medical nomenclature notwithstanding. So I thought that was great because it made us realize about the history of the body and history of vaginas, and that these are constructed literally as well as many other things in terms of histories of bodies. So it's not just something which is unchanging and endures for centuries nationally across different oceans. And then the workshop that Eiko led us in so brilliantly. So I was thinking you were talking about detail. Notice the detail, and to me that's a way that bodies are differentiated. So we have the idea of the body, which joins all of us, but then, and we all have symmetry of some kind, but then as we look at detail, so like the type of the hair, the texture of the hair, the color of the eyes, the shape of the eyes, our height, our rough skin, etc. So many ways that the details are giving us different types of bodies. So that made me think of the history of individual bodies and the history of this concept of the body. So with regard to my partner, I was very curious about your history. So as I was noticing details like the beautiful rings you had, like what does this ring mean on this body? So I was very curious, like I don't know your name, but just how I can learn these things, because we're not supposed to be speaking to each other. So we communicate in some ways by clothes, by our hair, etc. But I don't know if there's ever another piece of your workshop where you actually get to go out to tea with your partner. Get to know her. And then I was also thinking that with this, what you said was weird. It was weird, this like inspection with this fake telescope. I was thinking also about sound. So as someone who worked in music, and thinking also about Pauline Oliveros, who passed away last November, I guess about a year ago, just how we listen to another body. And Pauline Oliveros would have exercise where there would be a floor, and we would all sit on the floor and then have this practice of deep listening to each other, to ourselves, to our bodies, but also making sound. So it was very evocative to me, this practice of visualization and focusing on detail, but I was also trying to listen as well and bring in the sonic component. And then last, Brooke, your work, I also really, really enjoyed. So I'm teaching a course called Listening to Hip Hop right now. So we've been talking about race just this week in terms of like what has been considered a black music, and then Eminem as a white artist representing whiteness, and just this idea of taking something which is identified with a specific national or ethnic group and having it represented by someone else. I've worked a lot on John Zorn, the musician, composer, improviser, and have been very critical of his engagement with and relationship to Japan, and especially to Japanese women. So to me, it's very imbalanced in terms of he is the representer and he is the one who's making sounds, and the women are bound and silent and gagged, and so it's always deeply disturbed me, and so I always, in my postmodern and post-colonial feminist critique, have been looking for other examples, and I really, really enjoyed seeing your work, because to me it was quite refreshing to see someone who you acknowledge being a white American woman who is approaching Japan, but to me in not that way, which really disturbs me about Zorn's and other postmodern white American or European male artists, in that it's incredibly appropriative and representational, and they are the framing. So yours has so many layers with these invocations of Preston Sturges, and then I love the Bowie Nina Hagen example, because there's the line, I don't think it was in your example, of the cat from Japan. So again, it's like there's Bowie, and then this persona Ziggy Stardust, and then the coolness of Japan. But I thought your work is not shying away from this idea of I cannot work with something that is not me in some sense, and kind of demolishing that question of what one is allowed to work on, but doing it with a very brilliant sensitivity and creativity. So thank you.
Well, we are running a little late. I think we really want to take some questions, but I don't know. I want to hear from the trio here, that even just kind of, what do you think? Did you raise your
I
hand?
think they can, I mean,
Or do we just take questions and maybe direct them towards the artists? Okay, maybe we do that. And let's have some microphones here. Questions? Or comments? Comments?
Hello, Columbia Well. So they're all amazing and wonderful. Thank you all. I had a thought with your work, Mia, and I love the concept of vagina being, I guess I would ask your response. Vagina is not inevitably and not necessarily, but it can be the agency for reproduction, for creation of the physical form. And I was just curious if you had any correspondence or thought with that in terms of the kind of work you're doing, vibration, particles vibrating in a certain way, create shapes and forms of a certain type, and the fact that we're talking about the vagina, which can be the birth passageway.
Yeah, it's kind of been inspired, this piece, by the transgender community, and the vagina can be constructed, and then it can be surgically modified in certain ways, and that it's actually in the same way that, say, the vaginated ear can be a construction. And so in that sense, that if we can reconceive in the transgender body or the non-normative bodies, the vagina is reconceived and reconstructed. And I think that's really inspiring, because in a way we are empowered to also reconceive of our own organs, which have been kind of defined by a male hierarchy, and really kind of a certain kind of retaking of female sexuality, that the vagina doesn't have to be associated with sexual activity. It doesn't have to be associated with reproduction. And that's pretty much, it's, you know, as little girls, you're just taught it's a taboo and you can't talk about it. You're not supposed to touch yourself. You don't, even just the term until fairly recently, vagina, and you're not even supposed to say it. And so it's you know, the transgender community is kind of like the vanguard, I think, in terms of really redefining our organs in a certain sense, and is a real inspiration.
Thank you.
Other people? I'm Michael.
I wanted to give an illustration from my own life. When I was 19 or so, in my hometown in Massachusetts, I worked in the summer as a waiter. And the woman who had been my babysitter when I was a toddler, and who I hadn't seen in the interim 15 or so years, recognized me, not because I physically resembled my father, but because I gesturally resembled him. And so this is a way that sort of the history of my family was being passed down just through my unconscious physical gestures, and was outwardly recognizable to someone who knew me as a child and who knew my family. So that's an interesting way that history gets passed. But approaching it artistically, maybe someone would like to speak to the value of approaching history artistically instead of the like fixative way that that written history and literary history and classroom history sort of teaches us sort of a one way, this is what happened, and the way someone viewing an artwork that's engaging history has perhaps a more open mindset to receive a message that, I don't know, could be more or less fixed than it is in the classroom.
Could I do this? So for me, as an artist, and I'm a choreographer, so by definition I deal with time and space and body, right? And I don't make group piece. It means time and space and my body, and the viewer's body. So my biggest thing that I think all the time is how to make a distance malleable. So I didn't quite explain when I'm performing with Met. I'm not that interested in me performing with Met of itself, but I'm interested in bringing Fukushima with me. what I'm interested in Fukushima is tucked into my sleeves and my vagina or ears or whatnot. So, and by doing that, you kind of see my fixated, insistent visit, because I've been there 5 times since Melbourne, with no good reasons, no good reason. But when I go, I do feel it. I observe it. I notice the differences between the visit. I discover new places. I discover something about the way that Bill sees things as both historian and photographer, which are both to do with framing. And for me, it's a lot to do with imagining the people who are there, imagining the animals and the mountains who are there. So, but distance of imagining here is different, having the agency all around me to imagine that. And by bringing this, and if I stay in Metropolitan Museum's wall for 7.5 hours, which is as long as I'm allowed to do, then perhaps somebody who has seen it will have a little different relationship to the subject and the distance. And in a way, how then the next time that you see the term Fukushima, it actually means something other than, oh, it's in Japan, or that something had happened. So I'm kind of using my body almost like a washcloth. You wash the floor, and I washed the red clothes I have there. Those are actually inner liner of many kimonos. I took it out and sewed, right? So it means generations of my grandmothers and the geisha people had wore that kimono. So it's very relating to the history of blood, you know. And the blood is not only in a female body, it's in the earth. It's magma, right? So I'm kind of trying to relate all those things in a way how your babysitter had recognized your body gestures connecting to your father. I want to connect things.
Just another comment. I think also this complicated thing of history is like who makes history and history's relationship to power, and also, so I think women and so many of us have reasons to kind of question history or to push back against history or to say like that history that's spoken or illustrated is concealing which other history, and who it's, you know, back to the contemporary conversation of monumentalization and this idea that it's like holding history, but it's really like who makes those things and who chose those things and who represents how things are explained. So I think history is really just a jumping off point, and maybe the historians may not agree, but I just always think of it as a tool to kind of push back against, to learn from, but also to imagine around, or to be, you know, to always imagine the things that aren't being spoken.
Yeah, to imagine the things that aren't being spoken. I mean, I just want to say briefly, like, from the American lens of the Japanese experience, I'm Japanese American, so I'm 3rd generation Japanese. My grandparents are from Hiroshima and Fukuoka, and came over at the turn of the century. And then there was this, during World War II, which of course was this huge thing. I have relatives in Japan who died from leukemia from the radiation in Hiroshima. And also I had my dad shot in the leg, who was at they were kind, I don't want to say cannon fodder, but the 442nd was a Japanese American segregated unit that had the highest casualty rate of any other unit in American history. And so there was the victimization of my mom being in the concentration camps, and all of my aunts and uncles, and I would have been born in the concentration camps as well if I'd been born a few years later, like my older cousins were born in the camps. And so there's these layers of victimization that I don't want to think about, and actually growing up as a little kid, our jobs were to kind of look the other way and not think about the victimization of our families in Japan, and not think about the victimizations of my immediate family, and just to kind of block it out and have this kind of community amnesia, but kind of finding it again, I think, in different ways, somewhat from the Black Arts movement and the African American struggle, and that was often, I think, a real points of inspiration for a lot of Asians born in this country and Asians coming over, but the layers of victimization just get to be too much, and better not to think about it in a certain way because you can't function very well on that.
I actually find it really fascinating, we might be pretty close by age, So, and I'm born and grew up in Japan, right? And my job really was not to walk away. Because what Japan did during the war and after was something we had to live with. So we had a different growing up in a different place, which makes a different attitude and different method, which is so true.
So many people of your generation did walk away, didn't they? It was silence and so on. So it's not necessarily that you're...
Very hard not to.
Well, your generation,
yes, but still people did walk away.
Yes, there's not as silent. But for maybe the same reasons, just too much. My job. Miki, I'm going to leave it to you to call the...
I think we can take one or two more questions.
Okay.
So, Eiko, I just wanted to ask this question to you because I loved your movement workshop because it was focused a lot on experience. You close your eyes, you don't think about how you look. But also, dance is ultimately a visual art form. You have to see it to experience it. So, when you choreograph, how much of that is based experiential, and then how much of that is thinking about how it comes across visually, and how do you balance the two, or do you just not?
So I try to answer connecting to what we've been talking about. Okay. So right now, my job is my practice of being a choreographer is being spontaneously available for decision making. So I don't take all the decision making as absolute. So today I showed video. It was totally not in the order of what had happened. I re-choreographed the photos. So there I'm working as a choreographer. How do I deal with that? I would emerging, I would rehearse, but I don't write it down and I don't make certain decisions. Because in my solo practice, which only came after 40 years of working as Eiko Koma, in which we thoroughly fought, oh, you didn't do what you were supposed to have done, oh no, you just forgot, and stuff like that. I am now in a place where my process and end is more connected. So I've been trying to train myself as a performer where I can actually make decisions over the preparation. And sometimes I allow myself to even betray my own decisions. So I don't really make a product, I just make a process. But that doesn't mean I don't work to make a certain decisions, but that can be ignored.
I mean, I think that when you said that when you were talking about your process, I feel like this is, again, our kind of interrogative methods, where we don't assume, and you come from theater and I come from theater, there's this idea of like you imagine the end product, you know what you're making. But I think we're all sort of interested in these like little questions and teasing them out, even if in the end we know what the product is. And it's like, for mine, it's so formalized, whether or not you see it, I can never imagine. It's different than choreography, obviously, but you don't. I'm just kind of stepping up on that because I think it's so interesting. It's so valuable to a kind of making where you're not imagining the final experience between you and me, but you're just following something and like following one inspiration after another, which is the response also to history. You kind of keep teasing out ideas, or what do you like your research on the vagina. I don't know if you started from your research or your instinct in, and then what opens things up.
I think there are a lot more stories and questions, but I'm gonna say thank you to everyone for coming and speaking, and there's a reception, so please stick around and eat and just keep talking. There's also a taiko performance upstairs, which I hope you'll go check out. It's in room 315. They'll be playing for an hour. So please move around the building, talk, eat, listen.
This is like a cherry.
Yeah.
It's a picnic.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Mickey. As we go to the Tycho